The term serial killer was not invented until the 1970s. An FBI agent named Robert Ressler came up with it while studying patterns of repeat murderers. But the reality? These killers have been around for centuries, millennia, even. They just operated in a world without police databases, without DNA testing, without any real way to catch them. And that made them even more terrifying. So before you settle in, go ahead and like this video if you are ready for something heavy. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's darkest corners. And drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing the night owls and early risers who find these videos. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us walk back through time. Back to when killers had no names, no profiles, and no one to stop them. Imagine living in a world where murder investigations consisted of gathering the townspeople, pointing at the most suspicious-looking person and deciding their fate by throwing them in a river to see if they float. No fingerprints. No autopsy reports. No crime scene investigators in white suits carefully bagging evidence. Just fear, superstition, and a deep belief that evil came from demons, witches, or God's wrath. This was reality for most of human history. When a string of murders happened, people rarely connected them. Each death was treated as an isolated incident. A woman found strangled in an alley. A child gone missing from the village. A traveler discovered dead on the roadside. These were not seen as part of a pattern. They were just tragedies. Unfortunate events in a world already filled with disease, war, and random violence. And the killers? They thrived in that chaos. They moved from town to town, sometimes never caught, sometimes never even suspected. In medieval Europe, if a series of murders happened, people blamed wolves, bandits, or supernatural forces. The idea that one person could methodically kill multiple people over time for psychological gratification was not something anyone considered. It was outside the realm of understanding. Even when someone was caught, the trial was less about evidence and more about spectacle. Confessions were extracted through torture. Guilt was assumed. And execution was public, brutal, and meant to serve as a warning. But here is the thing. The real serial killers, the smart ones, the careful ones, they did not get caught. They kept killing. And history only remembers the ones who were so brazen, so reckless, or so unlucky that they finally got noticed. The first recorded cases of what we would now call serial murder date back thousands of years. Ancient texts from Rome, China, and Persia all contain stories of individuals who killed multiple people, not in warfare, not in self-defense, but for reasons that seemed incomprehensible at the time. Some killed for money, some killed for power, and some, disturbingly, seemed to kill simply because they enjoyed it. One of the earliest documented cases comes from ancient Rome, Locusta of Gaul. A woman who lived during the 1st century was a professional poisoner. She worked for the Roman elite, killing off inconvenient relatives, political rivals, and anyone else who needed to disappear quietly. Locusta was not a one-time killer. She poisoned dozens, maybe more. The Emperor Nero himself used her services, reportedly having her poison his stepbrother Britannicus so he could secure his claim to the throne. Locusta was eventually caught and executed, but not before she had trained others in the art of poison. Her legacy lived on through her students, spreading her methods across the empire. Roman historians wrote about her with a mix of horror and fascination. She was not seen as mentally ill or driven by compulsion. She was simply evil. A woman who killed for profit and possibly for the thrill of power over life and death. In ancient China, a similar case emerged during the Han Dynasty. A woman named Liu Pengli, a prince by title, was documented in historical records as having killed over 100 people during his reign of terror in the 2nd century. He would go out at night with a gang of followers, rob travelers, and murder them for sport. He was not killing for survival or out of necessity. He was doing it because he could. Because he enjoyed it. What makes Liu Pengli particularly chilling is that he was royalty. He had wealth, power, and status. He did not need to rob anyone. He did it for the thrill. When he was finally caught, the emperor could not execute him due to his royal blood. Instead, Liu Pengli was stripped of his title and exiled. But the people he killed, over 100 of them, were just gone. Their families had no justice. Their deaths were barely recorded, just another footnote in history. These early cases show us something important. Serial killers have always existed. The psychology, the compulsion, the need to kill, it is not a modern phenomenon. What is modern is our ability to recognize it, study it, and stop it. Back then, killers like Locusta and Liu Pengli were anomalies, monsters in human skin. No one understood why they did what they did. They just knew they needed to be stopped. Fast forward to medieval Europe, a time when superstition ruled every aspect of life. If crops failed, it was witchcraft. If someone got sick, it was a curse. And if people started dying in brutal, inexplicable ways, well, that was clearly the work of werewolves, vampires, or demonic possession. The idea that a normal-looking person could be responsible was too horrifying to accept. So instead, people created monsters to explain the unexplainable. The werewolf trials of Europe are some of the darkest examples of this. Between the 1500s and 1700s, thousands of people were accused of being werewolves. They were tortured, tried, and executed, often burned alive or broken on the wheel. And while many of these accusations were pure hysteria, some of them were rooted in real crimes, real murders, real serial killers who were finally being caught, even if they were being labeled as something supernatural. Take the case of Peter Stump, one of the most infamous so-called werewolves in history. In 1589, in the German town of Bedburg, Stump was accused of being a werewolf who had terrorized the region for over 20 years. According to court records, he confessed, under torture of course, to killing and eating 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and engaging in acts so vile they were barely recorded. Stump claimed he had a magic belt given to him by the devil that allowed him to transform into a wolf. He said he hunted his victims in the forest, tore them apart with his teeth, and drank their blood. The court believed him. Or at least they believed enough to convict him. His execution was one of the most brutal in history. He was strapped to a wheel, had his flesh torn from his body with red-hot pincers, his arms and legs broken, then beheaded. His body was burned, and his head was placed on a spike as a warning. Now, was Peter Stump actually a werewolf? Of course not. But was he a serial killer? Almost certainly. The kills attributed to him, the targeting of children, the brutality, the long time frame, these are all hallmarks of serial murder. But because people in the 1500s had no framework for understanding serial killers, they labeled him a monster in the most literal sense. They could not comprehend that a man could do these things simply because he wanted to. So they made him something other than human. Another case from the same era is Gilles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole. In 1573, Garnier was accused of killing and eating several children in the French countryside. Witnesses claimed they saw him attacking children in the form of a wolf. In reality, Garnier was likely a hermit, mentally disturbed, living in the woods and preying on vulnerable children who wandered too far from home. He was convicted of lycanthropy and witchcraft, then burned at the stake. These werewolf trials are tragic for two reasons. First, many innocent people were executed based on superstition and forced confessions. Second, actual serial killers were being caught, but instead of being studied or understood, they were simply destroyed and labeled as demonic. There was no attempt to understand the why. No one asked what drove these men to kill. They were just eliminated, and the next killer continued his work somewhere else. If there is one name from medieval history that stands out as a clear example of a serial killer, it is Gilles de Rais. Born into French nobility in 1404, Gilles started his life as a war hero. He fought alongside Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War, earning fame, titles, and the favor of the king. He was wealthy, powerful, and respected. On paper, he had everything. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. After Joan of Arc was captured and executed, Gilles withdrew from public life. He returned to his estates in Brittany and began a descent into what can only be described as madness. Or perhaps the madness had always been there, just hidden beneath the surface. He became obsessed with alchemy, trying to summon demons to restore his dwindling fortune. He hosted lavish parties and spent money recklessly. And somewhere in that darkness he began killing children. Between 1432 and 1440, Gilles de Rais is believed to have murdered between 80 and 200 children. Most of them were boys, aged 6 to 18, lured from nearby villages with promises of work or food. Once inside his castle, they were tortured, sexually assaulted, and killed. Gilles kept detailed records of his crimes, describing the acts with disturbing precision. He even preserved some of their remains, keeping them in his private chambers. His reign of terror ended in 1440 when the Bishop of Nantes began investigating rumors of missing children around Gilles' estates. When authorities finally entered his castle, they found evidence of unspeakable horrors. Blood-stained rooms, remains hidden in walls, testimonies from servants who had been forced to help dispose of bodies. Gilles was arrested, and during his trial he confessed to everything. Not under torture, which was rare, but seemingly out of a desire to repent before God. He described his crimes in chilling detail. How he enjoyed watching his victims suffer. How he felt no remorse until after the act was done. How he believed he was damned but could not stop himself. His confessions are some of the earliest recorded accounts of what we now recognize as serial killer psychology. The compulsion, the lack of empathy, the cycle of killing, guilt, and then killing again. Gilles de Rais was executed in 1440, hanged and then burned, but his story did not end there. It became the basis for the Bluebeard fairy tale, a story about a wealthy man who murders his wives and hides their bodies in a locked room. The tale was sanitized for children, but its roots were in the very real horrors of Gilles de Rais. He was not a werewolf. He was not possessed. He was a serial killer, operating centuries before anyone had the language to describe what he was. While Gilles de Rais terrorized France, another noble was committing similar atrocities in Hungary. Elizabeth Bathory, born in 1560 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Europe, is often called the most prolific female serial killer in history. The exact number of her victims is unknown, but estimates range from 80 to over 600 young women. And like Gilles, she used her wealth and status to shield herself from suspicion for years. Elizabeth married young and moved to Lactis Castle in present-day Slovakia. Her husband, a military commander, was frequently away at war, leaving her alone with her servants and an enormous estate to manage. It was during this time, according to testimonies from her trial, that she began torturing and killing servant girls. The methods were brutal: beatings, burnings, freezing girls in the winter cold and pouring water over them until they died, mutilations, starvation. The cruelty was staggering. Legend says she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, but this was likely added later to sensationalize her story. The real Elizabeth Bathory did not need to drink blood or bathe in it. She tortured and killed because she enjoyed the power it gave her. She enjoyed the control. She enjoyed watching others suffer. And because she was nobility, no one questioned her for years. Servant girls went missing. Families were told their daughters had run away or died of illness. No one investigated. Her downfall came in 1610 when she made a critical mistake. She began killing daughters of lower nobility, not just peasant girls. When girls from respectable families started disappearing, people noticed. A Lutheran minister collected testimonies from survivors and sent them to the king. Authorities raided Lactus Castle and found bodies hidden in the castle grounds, girls dying in cells, and evidence of systematic torture. Elizabeth Bathory was never formally tried. Because of her noble blood, she could not be executed. Instead, she was walled into a small room in her own castle, with only a slit for food and air. She lived there for 4 years before dying in 1614. Her accomplices, however, were not so lucky. They were tortured, mutilated, and executed publicly. Their testimonies described Elizabeth as calm, methodical, and completely devoid of remorse. She killed because she could, because no one stopped her, and because, in her mind, the lives of peasant girls simply did not matter. Elizabeth Bathory is a perfect example of how power and wealth can enable serial killers. She operated for years, possibly decades, without consequence. Her victims were voiceless, disposable, and in a feudal society where nobility ruled absolutely, there was no justice for them. It took the deaths of girls from noble families to finally bring her down. And even then, she was spared execution simply because of her bloodline. Justice, in the 1600s, was not blind. It had eyes only for the powerful. Not all serial killers in history were driven by sadistic pleasure. Some killed for profit. And in many ways, these killers were even more dangerous because they were calculated, patient, and nearly impossible to detect. Before modern toxicology, poison was the perfect murder weapon. It was quiet. It mimicked natural illness. And unless someone had a reason to suspect foul play, the victim was simply buried and forgotten. Throughout history, professional poisoners existed in nearly every culture. In ancient Rome, poisoning was so common among the elite that emperors employed food tasters to protect themselves. In Renaissance Italy, the Borgia family was rumored to have used a secret poison called cantarella to eliminate rivals. And in 1700s France, a network of poisoners operated so openly that it became a national scandal. The affair of the poisons, as it became known, rocked the French court in the 1670s. It began when King Louis XIV ordered an investigation into rumors that members of his court were using fortune-tellers and poisoners to kill rivals and unwanted spouses. What they uncovered was a massive criminal network led by a woman named Catherine de Chaise, known as La Voisin. La Voisin was a fortune-teller who also sold poisons, performed illegal abortions, and allegedly conducted black masses for aristocratic clients. She had connections to some of the most powerful people in France, including members of the royal court. During the investigation, over 400 people were arrested, and at least 36 were executed. Lavoisienne herself was burned at the stake in 1680 after refusing to confess under torture. But here's the thing, Lavoisienne was not acting alone. She had a network of associates, other fortune-tellers and poisoners who supplied clients across Paris. One of her associates, Marie Bosse, reportedly sold poison to over 2,000 clients. 2,000, think about that. 2,000 people, mostly women, buying poison to kill husbands, rivals, or inconvenient relatives. This was not isolated murder. This was industrialized killing. The scandal was so massive that King Louis eventually shut down the investigation to protect the reputation of the court. Many of the accused were quietly exiled or imprisoned without trial. The full truth of how many people died in the affair of the poisons will never be known. But what we do know is that professional poisoning was shockingly common in the 1600s and 1700s. And the killers, often women who operated in the shadows, were some of the most prolific serial killers in history. Not all historical serial killers operated from positions of power or used subtle methods like poison. Some were far more direct. They were the bandits, highwaymen, and outlaws who haunted the roads of Europe, Asia, and the Americas. They robbed travelers, and when robbery was not enough, they killed, again and again, often leaving no witnesses. In the 1600s and 1700s, traveling was incredibly dangerous. Roads were poorly maintained, often just dirt paths through forests or mountains. There were no police patrols, no streetlights, no way to call for help. If you were attacked, you were on your own, and bandits knew this. They set up ambush points in remote areas, waited for travelers, and struck without warning. Some only took valuables. Others took lives. One of the most notorious was a French bandit named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. In the late 1700s, he and his gang terrorized travelers along the roads near Paris. They robbed coaches, killed anyone who resisted, and dumped bodies in the woods. Pelletier was eventually caught and became the first person executed by guillotine in 1792. But by then he had killed an estimated 20 to 30 people. In India, the Thuggee cult operated for centuries as a network of highway robbers who also practiced ritual murder. Thuggees would join groups of travelers, gain their trust, and then strangle them in their sleep using a ceremonial cloth. They believed they were killing in honor of the goddess Kali. The British colonial government estimated that Thuggees killed between 50,000 and 2 million people over several centuries, though those numbers are likely exaggerated. Even conservative estimates put the number in the tens of thousands. The Thuggees were finally suppressed in the mid-1800s by British authorities who conducted mass arrests and executions. But for centuries, they operated openly, killing travelers and merchants across India. They were not seen as serial killers. They were seen as a religious sect, a criminal organization. But the reality is that many individual Thuggee members were serial killers who killed dozens or even hundreds of people over their lifetimes. Here is the challenge with studying serial killers from history. The records are incomplete, biased, and often completely unreliable. When someone was accused of murder in the 1500s or 1600s, their trial was not about finding the truth. It was about confirming what people already believed. Torture was used to extract confessions. Witnesses were pressured. And once someone confessed, their words were taken as absolute truth, no matter how impossible the claims. Take the werewolf trials, for example. Dozens of people confessed to transforming into wolves and eating children. Did that actually happen? Of course not. But under torture, people will confess to anything. So when we read historical accounts of serial killers, we have to ask ourselves, How much of this is real? How much is exaggeration? How much is just hysteria and superstition? In some cases like Gila de Reis and Elizabeth Bathory, there is enough physical evidence and witness testimony to confirm that yes, these people were serial killers. Bodies were found. Survivors testified. The crimes were documented in multiple sources, but in other cases, the evidence is much weaker. Maybe the person was a serial killer. Or maybe they were just an unpopular person who got blamed for a series of unrelated deaths. We will never know for sure. Another problem is that many serial killers were never caught. They killed in one town, moved to another, and disappeared into history. Without modern communication or record keeping, there was no way to track them. A man could kill in Paris, flee to London, kill again, and no one would ever connect the crimes. The killer would just vanish, leaving behind only whispers and fear. This is why the true number of historical serial killers will never be known. For every Gila de Reis or Elizabeth Bathory, there were probably dozens of others who simply got away with it. Killers who died of old age, never caught, never suspected. Their victims were buried, their crimes forgotten, and history moved on without ever knowing their names. One of the most fascinating aspects of studying historical serial killers is seeing how their crimes shaped mythology. When people could not explain why someone would kill repeatedly, they created monsters, vampires, werewolves, demons, witches. These creatures became the scapegoats for real human evil. And in many cases, the legends were directly inspired by actual serial killers. The vampire myth, for example, likely has roots in serial killers who were accused of drinking blood. Elizabeth Bathory, though the bathing in blood story is probably false, was certainly accused of it during her time. And there were other cases throughout Europe of killers who mutilated bodies and engaged in acts that seemed vampiric to terrified villagers. When a body was found drained of blood or with bite marks, people did not think serial killer. They thought vampire. Similarly, the werewolf legend was fed by cases like Peter Stump and Gilles Garnier. Men who killed in brutal animalistic ways were labeled as werewolves because that made more sense to people than the idea that a human could do such things. The werewolf myth gave people a framework for understanding the unexplainable. It was not a man killing children. It was a cursed creature, something other, something that could be destroyed. Even the tale of Bluebeard, the fairy tale about a man who murders his wives, comes directly from real serial killers. Gilles de Reis inspired the story, but so did other historical figures like Henri Landru, a French serial killer from the early 1900s who murdered at least 10 women. The story of Bluebeard has been retold for centuries, sanitized for children, but its roots are in very real horror. These myths served a purpose. They allowed people to process the incomprehensible. They gave communities a way to talk about evil without having to confront the fact that evil could live next door, smile at you in the market, and then go home and kill someone. Monsters were easier to accept than the truth. That humans, ordinary humans, were capable of extraordinary cruelty. Throughout history, mental illness was not understood. It was feared. If someone behaved strangely, heard voices, or experienced delusions, they were not sent to a doctor. They were locked away, exorcised, or executed. And in some cases, people suffering from severe mental illness committed violent crimes that would today be recognized as the acts of someone desperately in need of psychiatric care. Some historical serial killers likely suffered from conditions like schizophrenia, psychosis, or severe personality disorders. But instead of being treated, they were labeled as possessed or evil. Their crimes were seen as proof of demonic influence, not mental illness. And because there was no treatment, no therapy, no medication, these individuals either killed until they were caught or lived their entire lives in torment. Take the case of Gilles de Rais. His confessions describe a man tormented by his own compulsions. He said he knew what he was doing was wrong. He begged God for forgiveness. But he could not stop. This is consistent with what we now understand about serial killers. Many of them experience compulsions they feel powerless to resist. They are not possessed. They are not evil in some supernatural sense. They are deeply, profoundly broken. But in medieval and early modern Europe, there was no framework for understanding this. Mental illness was spiritual illness. If you could not control your impulses, it was because the devil had you. If you heard voices, they were demons whispering to you. If you felt compelled to kill, it was not a psychological issue. It was a moral failing. And the only solution was punishment, not treatment. This lack of understanding meant that serial killers, particularly those driven by mental illness, were dealt with through execution or imprisonment. They were removed from society, but nothing was learned. No one asked why they killed. No one studied their minds. They were just eliminated and the next killer took their place. It was not until the late 1800s and early 1900s that psychiatry began to develop, and even then, it took decades before criminal psychology became a field of study. When we think of serial killers, we often picture men. And statistically, the vast majority of serial killers throughout history have been male. But women were killers too. They just did it differently. Where men tended to be more violent and direct, women often used poison, suffocation, or other methods that left fewer visible signs. And because society did not expect women to be violent, they often got away with it for years. Elizabeth Bathory is the most famous example, but she is far from the only one. Throughout history, women killed for many of the same reasons men did: money, power, revenge, and sometimes just because they wanted to. But they were often overlooked or dismissed. A woman poisoning her husband was tragic, not criminal. A midwife whose patients kept dying was unlucky, not murderous. Society's blind spot when it came to women, and violence allowed female serial killers to operate in plain sight. One example is Giulia Tofana, an Italian woman who lived in the 1600s. She created a poison called aqua tofana, a mixture of arsenic, lead, and belladonna that was colorless, tasteless, and deadly. She sold it to women who wanted to murder their husbands. The poison was disguised as a cosmetic product, often in small vials with religious imagery. Giulia claimed to be helping women escape abusive marriages. In reality, she was enabling murder on a massive scale. It is estimated that aqua tofana was responsible for the deaths of over 600 men. Giulia and her accomplices were eventually caught and executed in 1659, but the poison had spread across Italy and beyond. Other poisoners copied her methods, and aqua tofana remained in circulation for decades. Giulia Tofana herself did not kill those men directly, but she made their deaths possible. She was a serial killer by proxy. Another case is that of Amelia Dear, a British woman who operated in the late 1800s. She ran a baby farming business, taking in unwanted infants from unmarried mothers in exchange for payment. But instead of caring for the children, she killed them. Dyer strangled or drugged at least 400 babies over a 20-year period, disposing of their bodies in the Thames River. She was only caught when a package containing a dead infant washed ashore. Amelia Dyer was tried, convicted, and hanged in 1896, but here is the chilling part. Baby farming was common in Victorian England. Unwed mothers had few options, and many women like deer operated openly. How many others were killing children and never got caught? How many babies died and were simply buried without investigation? The answer is we will never know. But Amelia Dyer was not an anomaly. She was just the one who got caught. By the 1700s, Europe was changing. Cities were growing. London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin were exploding in population as people flooded in from the countryside looking for work. And with that growth came chaos, overcrowding, poverty, crime, and the perfect environment for serial killers to thrive. In a city of hundreds of thousands where no one knew their neighbors, a killer could operate for years without being noticed. Police forces, as we understand them today, barely existed. London did not have an organized police department until 1829. Before that, there were night watchmen, constables, and militias, but they were poorly trained, poorly paid, and often corrupt. If someone was murdered, there was no detective assigned to investigate, no forensic team, no organized effort to catch the killer. Just a body, a vague description, and a lot of fear. This was the perfect storm for serial killers. They had dense populations to hunt in. They had law enforcement that was barely functional. And they had victims, poor people, prostitutes, beggars, people whose deaths would not be seriously investigated. The invisible people of society. The ones no one would miss. In the mid-1800s, in the rural region of Galicia, Spain, a traveling salesman named Manuel Blanco Romasanta became one of the most documented serial killers of his time. Between 1846 and 1850, Romasanta is believed to have killed at least 9 people, possibly 13. And here's where it gets strange. He claimed he was a werewolf. Romasanta was born in 1809 and lived his early life as a woman before transitioning to present as male. He worked as a tailor and later as a traveling guide, helping people navigate the dangerous mountain roads between villages. It was the perfect cover. He offered to escort travelers through the wilderness. And then they disappeared. Women, children, entire families, gone. Their bodies, when found, were often mutilated and partially consumed by animals. Or so people thought. When Romasanta was finally arrested in 1852, he confessed to the murders. But his defense was extraordinary. He claimed he suffered from a curse that turned him into a wolf. He said he had no control over the transformations and no memory of the killings. He blamed a curse placed on him by a witch. His lawyers tried to argue that he was insane, suffering from lycanthropy, a delusional belief that one can transform into a wolf. This was one of the first cases in history where mental illness was seriously considered as a defense in a serial murder trial. Some doctors examined Romasanta and declared him mad. Others said he was perfectly sane and simply using the werewolf story to avoid execution. The case became a sensation, debated in newspapers and medical journals across Europe. Was he a monster? Was he insane? Or was he just a cold, calculating killer using superstition to save his own life? Romasanta was initially sentenced to death, but Queen Isabella II of Spain commuted his sentence to life in prison after a French hypnotist claimed he could cure Romasanta of his supposed lycanthropy. Romasanta died in prison in 1863, and to this day, his case is studied as one of the earliest examples of criminal psychology intersecting with serial murder. He was not a werewolf, but he was absolutely a serial killer. In 1827 Edinburgh, Scotland, 2 Irish immigrants named William Burke and William Hare discovered a lucrative business opportunity. Medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy lessons, and they were willing to pay. A lot. Grave robbing was common, but Burke and Hare realized they could skip the hard work of digging up graves. They could just create their own corpses. Over the course of 10 months, Burke and Hare murdered at least 16 people, possibly more. Their method was simple and brutal. They targeted the poor, the drunk, and the vulnerable. They would get their victims intoxicated, suffocate them, and then sell the bodies to Dr. Robert Knox, a prominent anatomist who asked no questions. Knox paid between £7 and £10 per body, a small fortune at the time. The murders only came to light when a lodger at the boarding house where Hare lived discovered a body hidden under a bed. Police were called, and the entire operation unraveled. Burke and Hare were arrested, along with their partners, Helen McDougall and Margaret Hare. But here is the twist. There was not enough evidence to convict both men, so Hare made a deal. He agreed to testify against Burke in exchange for immunity. William Burke was convicted and hanged in January 1829. His execution was attended by a crowd of over 25,000 people, one of the largest public executions in Scottish history. In a darkly ironic twist, Burke's body was publicly dissected at the Edinburgh Medical College, the same institution that had purchased many of his victims. His skeleton is still on display there today. William Hare walked free and disappeared into obscurity. Dr. Knox was never charged, though his reputation was destroyed. The Burke and Hare murders changed British law. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed, allowing medical schools to legally obtain unclaimed bodies from workhouses. This largely ended the grave robbing trade and removed the financial incentive for murder. But Burke and Hare remain infamous as some of the most cold-blooded killers of the 19th century. They did not kill out of rage or compulsion. They killed because it was profitable, and they would have kept going if they had not been caught. In the mid-1800s, a Breton woman named Helen Jagato worked as a cook and domestic servant in northwestern France. She seemed unremarkable, quiet, hardworking, devout, but everywhere she worked, people died, and they died in agony. Hélène Jagato was one of the most prolific poisoners in history, responsible for the deaths of at least 23 people, possibly as many as 60. Jagato was born in 1803 and began working as a servant in her teens. Her first confirmed victims were members of the household where she worked in 1833. 7 people in that house died within months of each other. All experienced violent stomach pains, vomiting, and convulsions before death. Doctors attributed the deaths to cholera, which was epidemic at the time. No one suspected Jagato. Over the next 18 years, Jagato moved from household to household, leaving a trail of bodies behind her. She poisoned employers, fellow servants, and even people she seemed to genuinely like. Her method was consistent. She used arsenic, which she mixed into food and drinks. Arsenic poisoning mimics cholera, so in an era before toxicology, her crimes went undetected. She became known as someone cursed with bad luck because death seemed to follow her everywhere. Her downfall came in 1851 when she was working as a cook in Rennes. A fellow servant named Rosalie Sarrazin became ill after drinking soup prepared by Jagato. Rosalie accused Jagato of poisoning her before dying. This time doctors were suspicious. They performed an autopsy and found lethal amounts of arsenic in Rosalie's body. Police investigated and discovered that everywhere Jagato had worked, people had died under mysterious circumstances. Jagato was arrested and put on trial. During the trial, she remained calm and insisted she was innocent. She claimed she was cursed and that death followed her through no fault of her own. But the evidence was overwhelming. Exhumations were ordered and arsenic was found in multiple victims. Witnesses testified that Giotto had access to all the victims' food and drink. In February 1852, she was convicted of 3 murders, though authorities suspected many more. She was guillotined on February 26, 1852. What made Helene Giotto so dangerous was her invisibility. She was a servant, a woman, someone society did not scrutinize. She moved freely between households, and no one thought to question why death followed her. She is believed to be one of the first serial killers whose crimes were connected through early forensic toxicology. Without the autopsy of Rosalie Sarrazin, Giotto might have died of old age, never caught, her victims forgotten. In the early 1870s, a family operated a small inn and general store in Labette County, Kansas. The family consisted of John Bender, his wife Elvira, their daughter Kate, and their son John Jr. To travelers passing through, they seemed like ordinary frontier settlers. But behind the walls of their home, the Benders were running a murder operation that would become one of the most infamous cases in American history. The Bender family home was positioned along the Osage Trail, a major route for travelers heading west. They offered food and lodging to weary travelers. The layout of the home was simple. A main room divided by a canvas curtain. Guests would sit at a table with their backs to the curtain. Behind that curtain, one of the Benders would wait with a hammer. When the moment was right, they would strike the guest on the back of the head, drag the body into the cellar, rob them, and bury them in the property's orchard. The murders came to light in 1873 when a local doctor named William York went missing after announcing he would be stopping at the Bender Inn. His brother, a colonel in the military, led a search party. When they arrived at the Bender property, the family had vanished. The house was empty. But when investigators searched the grounds, they found a nightmare. A trap door led to a cellar soaked in dried blood. Outside, they discovered at least 11 bodies buried in shallow graves. Men, women, and even a child. All had been bludgeoned to death. The Bender family was never caught. They disappeared completely, likely fleeing west or changing their identities. Despite a massive manhunt and a reward of thousands of dollars, they were never found. Some believe they were caught and lynched by vigilantes who never reported it. Others think they successfully escaped and lived out their lives in anonymity. To this day, the fate of the Bloody Benders remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American crime. What makes the Benders unique is that they operated as a family unit. Serial killers usually work alone. But the Benders turned murder into a family business. They'd planned together, killed together, and profited together. And they did it on the American frontier, a lawless place where people disappeared all the time and no one asked too many questions. They are believed to have killed at least 11 people, possibly many more. And they got away with it. And now we come to the most famous serial killer in history. The one whose name everyone knows, even though no one knows who he actually was. Jack the Ripper. In the fall of 1888, in the Whitechapel district of London, someone began killing prostitutes. And the murders were so brutal, so shocking, and so public that they changed the way the world thought about murder forever. Whitechapel was one of the poorest areas of London, overcrowded, filthy, desperate. Thousands of people lived in cramped tenements and slept in doss houses, cheap lodgings where you could rent a bed for a few pennies. Many women turned to prostitution just to survive. And in that environment, 5 women were murdered between August and November 1888. Marian Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. These are the canonical 5. The victims most experts agree were killed by the same person. The murders were horrific, throats cut, bodies mutilated, organs removed with what seemed like surgical precision. The killer struck quickly, often in public spaces, and disappeared into the night. Despite a massive police presence and hundreds of officers patrolling the streets, he was never caught. Not even close. The police had no forensic tools, no fingerprint analysis, no DNA testing. They had witnesses who gave conflicting descriptions. They had letters, supposedly from the killer, most of which were hoaxes. And they had panic. What made Jack the Ripper different from every serial killer before him was the media. Newspapers covered the story obsessively. Headlines screamed about the Whitechapel murderer. Penny dreadfuls, cheap sensationalist publications sold millions of copies with lurid illustrations of the crimes. The public was horrified and fascinated in equal measure. People walked the streets of Whitechapel, hoping to catch a glimpse of something gruesome. Tourists visited the murder sites. Jack the Ripper became a celebrity killer, the first of his kind. The killer's identity has been debated for over a century. Suspects have included a deranged doctor, a Polish immigrant, a member of the royal family, even a woman. Entire books have been written proposing theories. DNA analysis has been attempted on evidence preserved from the crime scenes. But the truth is, we will never know who Jack the Ripper was. He killed at least 5 women, possibly more, and then stopped. Either he died, moved, was imprisoned for another crime, or simply decided to stop. The mystery remains unsolved. But Jack the Ripper's legacy is not just about the murders, it is about how those murders changed the world. The case led to reforms in London's police force. It sparked the beginning of criminal profiling. And it created the modern media obsession with serial killers. Every killer since then, from Ted Bundy to the Zodiac Killer, owes part of their infamy to Jack the Ripper. He was the first serial killer to become a myth, and that myth has never died. While Jack the Ripper terrorized London, another killer was operating in the United States. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but he is better known by his alias H. Holmes, and unlike Jack the Ripper, who killed in dark alleys, Holmes built a castle specifically designed for murder. He is often called America's first serial killer, and his story is as chilling as it is calculated. Holmes was born in 1861 in New Hampshire. He was intelligent, charming, and completely devoid of empathy. He studied medicine, graduated, and moved to Chicago in the late 1880s. He took a job at a pharmacy, seduced the owner's wife, and eventually took over the business after the owner mysteriously disappeared. With the profits, Holmes purchased a lot across the street and began constructing a building that would become known as the Murder Castle. The building was a 3-story mixed-use structure. The ground floor was retail space. The upper floors were a labyrinth of rooms, secret passages, soundproof chambers, trapdoors, and chutes that led to the basement. Holmes designed it himself, constantly changing builders so no one knew the full layout. He installed gas lines in some rooms so he could asphyxiate victims. He built airtight vaults where people could be locked and suffocated. The basement contained a dissection table, acid vats, and a furnace large enough to cremate a human body. Holmes opened his building as a hotel during the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Thousands of visitors flooded the city, and many of them stayed at Holmes's hotel. Young women mostly. Travelers with no local connections. People no one would miss. Holmes would charm them, sometimes marry them, take their money, and then kill them. He would strip the flesh from their bones and sell the skeletons to medical schools. He would take out life insurance policies on some victims and collect when they died. Murder, for Holmes, was a business. The exact number of Holmes's victims is unknown. He confessed to 27 murders, but investigators believe the number could be as high as 200. Many bodies were never found. Many victims were never identified. Holmes was finally arrested in 1894, not for murder, but for insurance fraud. It was only during the investigation into his financial crimes that police discovered the murder castle and the extent of his atrocities. Holmes was tried, convicted, and hanged on May 7, 1896. Even at his execution, he remained calm and composed. He gave interviews, sold his story to newspapers, and treated his own death like a final performance. He was a showman to the end. His murder castle was partially destroyed by fire shortly after his arrest, and the remaining structure was eventually demolished. But the story of H. Holmes has endured, a nightmare made real in brick and mortar. While H. Holmes was building his murder castle in Chicago, another killer was wandering the French countryside. Joseph Vacher, known as the French Ripper, was a drifter who murdered at least 11 people, possibly more between 1894 and 1897. His victims were shepherds, farm workers, and young people working alone in fields. And his crimes were so brutal that he terrified rural France for years. Vacher was born in 1869 and had a troubled life from the beginning. He served in the military but was discharged after attempting suicide following a failed romance. The suicide attempt left him partially paralyzed on one side of his face, giving him a disturbing appearance. He drifted from town to town, working odd jobs, begging for food, and slowly descending into violence. Vacher's first known murder occurred in May 1894 when he killed a 21-year-old woman named Eugenie Delhomme. Over the next 3 years, he killed at least 10 more people. His victims were usually found in isolated areas, their throats slashed, their bodies mutilated. Many had been sexually assaulted. Vacher showed no pattern in terms of victim type. He killed men and women, teenagers and adults, anyone he encountered in a vulnerable moment. What made Vacher difficult to catch was his constant movement. He never stayed in one place. He walked from village to village, sometimes covering hundreds of miles. There was no central police database, no way to connect murders happening in different regions. Each killing was investigated locally, and no one realized they were dealing with a serial killer until years into his spree. Vacher was finally caught in August 1897 when he attacked a woman named Marie Eugenie Plantier. She fought back, screaming for help. Her husband and several other men subdued Vacher and handed him over to police. During interrogation, Vacher confessed to multiple murders, claiming he was insane and not responsible for his actions. He said he suffered from a blood disease contracted from a rabid dog bite, which drove him to kill. Vacher's trial became a landmark case in criminal psychology. The famous criminologist Alexandre Lacassagne examined him and concluded that while Vacher had some mental health issues, he was fully aware of his actions and was legally sane. The court agreed. Vacher was convicted and guillotined on December 31, 1898. His case helped establish the field of forensic psychiatry in France and demonstrated that mental illness alone was not enough to excuse premeditated murder. In the spring of 1918, as World War I raged in Europe, a different kind of terror gripped New Orleans. Someone was breaking into homes at night and attacking people with axes or straight razors. The attacks were brutal, seemingly random, and absolutely terrifying. The killer became known as the Axeman of New Orleans, and his reign of terror lasted over a year, leaving at least 6 people dead and many more wounded. The Axeman's method was consistent. He would chisel out a panel in a back door, slip inside while the residents slept, and attacked them with an axe or razor taken from the home itself. He targeted Italian immigrants, specifically grocers, leading some to believe the attacks were motivated by ethnic hatred or connected to organized crime, but no clear motive ever emerged. The killer seemed to strike randomly, disappearing into the night without a trace. What made the Axeman truly infamous was a letter he allegedly sent to newspapers in March 1919. The letter, written in a theatrical style, claimed to be from the killer himself. In it, he declared that he was a demon from hell and announced that on the night of March 19th, he would kill again. But he promised to spare any home where jazz music was playing. The letter ended with a chilling declaration. "I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing." On the night of March 19th, 1919, New Orleans exploded with jazz music. Dance halls were packed. People threw parties in their homes, playing records and live music late into the night. It was one of the strangest responses to a serial killer in history, and it worked. No one was attacked that night. Whether the letter was genuine or a hoax, the Axeman did not strike. The attacks continued sporadically through 1919, but after October of that year, they stopped. The Axeman simply vanished. No one was ever arrested. No suspects were ever seriously pursued. Theories ranged from a single killer to multiple copycats, from a mafia enforcer to a mentally disturbed individual. To this day, the identity of the Axeman of New Orleans remains unknown. What makes the Axeman case significant is how it captured public imagination. The letter, whether real or fake, turned the killer into a cultural phenomenon. Songs were written about him. Jazz bands played tribute tunes. He became part of New Orleans folklore. And like Jack the Ripper before him, the Axeman proved that serial killers could terrorize an entire city and then disappear, leaving behind only fear and mystery. Not all historical serial killers were mysterious figures who vanished into the night. Some were caught, tried, and documented in exhaustive detail. Carl Panzram was one of those killers. Born in 1891 in Minnesota, Panzram lived a life defined by violence, rage, and an absolute hatred of humanity. He confessed to 21 murders and claimed to have committed over 1,000 acts of sodomy, many through rape. He is one of the most thoroughly documented serial killers in history, largely because he wrote an autobiography while on death row. Panzram's childhood was brutal. He was born into poverty, abused by his family, and sent to reform school at age 11 for a minor theft. At the reform school, he was beaten, tortured, and sexually assaulted by staff and older boys. He later said that the reform school turned him into a criminal. Before that, he was just a kid. After that, he was a monster in the making. Panzram spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. He committed burglaries, arsons, and assaults. He traveled the world, working on ships, and claimed to have killed people in multiple countries, including the United States, Angola, and the Philippines. In one horrific account, he said he hired 6 men to work on a boat, took them into a crocodile-infested river, shot them, and fed their bodies to the crocodiles. Whether this story is true remains uncertain, but given Panzram's documented violence, it is not impossible. Panzram was arrested for the final time in 1928 after burglarizing a home in Washington, D.C. While in prison, he killed a civilian laundry worker, crushing his skull with an iron bar. This murder earned him a death sentence. While on death row, a prison guard named Henry Lesser befriended him and convinced him to write his life story. The result was a 20,000-word autobiography filled with graphic descriptions of violence, rape, and murder. Panzram's writings are chilling not because of the acts he describes, but because of his complete lack of remorse. He despised humanity. He wanted to cause as much suffering as possible before he died. When asked if he had any regrets, he said his only regret was that he had not killed more people. When efforts were made to commute his death sentence, Panzram fought against them. He wanted to die. He begged to be executed. On September 5, 1930, Karl Panzram was hanged at Leavenworth Prison. His final words to the executioner were, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could hang a dozen men while you are fooling around." He was 39 years old. His autobiography was published decades later and remains one of the most disturbing first-person accounts of a serial killer's mind. Panzram was not insane. He was not delusional. He was simply filled with rage, and he spent his entire life inflicting that rage on others. In the late 1920s, the German city of Dusseldorf was terrorized by a killer who seemed to strike without pattern or reason. His victims included men, women, and children. Some were stabbed, some were bludgeoned, some were strangled, and many were sexually assaulted. The killer was eventually identified as Peter Curtin, a mild-mannered factory worker who became known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Curtin was born in 1883 into an abusive alcoholic household. He witnessed his father rape his mother and siblings. He was introduced to violence and sadism at a young age when a local dog catcher taught him how to torture animals. By his teens, Curtin had already committed his first murders, drowning 2 boys during a boating accident that he later admitted was deliberate. Curtin spent much of his early adult life in prison for theft and assault. It was in prison that he developed elaborate violent fantasies, imagining murders in graphic detail. When he was finally released in 1921, he married a woman who had no idea of his past or his desires. To the outside world, Curtin appeared normal, quiet, polite, but inside he was planning his next kill. Between 1929 and 1930, Curtin went on a killing spree in Dusseldorf. He murdered at least 9 people, possibly more, and attempted to kill many others. His victims ranged from young children to adult women to a sleeping man he attacked with a hammer. Curtin later said he did not care who his victims were. He simply enjoyed the act of killing. He said he felt a thrill watching his victims suffer, and he often returned to crime scenes to relive the experience. Curtin's nickname, the Vampire of Dusseldorf, came from reports that he drank the blood of some victims. He later confirmed this, saying he found the act sexually arousing. He also admitted to attacking swans and other animals, drinking their blood when human victims were not available. He was, by his own admission, addicted to violence and blood. Curtin was caught in May 1930 after one of his intended victims escaped and reported him to police. He confessed immediately and in extraordinary detail, describing each murder, each assault, each moment of pleasure he derived from violence. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On July 2, 1931, Peter Curtin was guillotined. His final request was to hear his own blood gush from his neck after the blade fell. The executioner did not grant it. Curtin's case is significant because it was one of the first times a serial killer's psychology was extensively studied. Forensic psychiatrists examined him, and his detailed confessions provided insight into the mind of a sadistic killer. His story influenced criminal psychology for decades and served as a case study in how childhood, trauma, and early exposure to violence can shape a serial killer. But it also showed that not all killers can be rehabilitated. Some, like Curtin, are simply too broken. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, something remarkable began to happen. Science started to catch up with serial killers. For the first time in history, investigators had tools beyond witness testimony and forced confessions. Fingerprint analysis was developed in the late 1800s. Blood typing was discovered in 1901. Ballistics analysis improved. And slowly, painfully slowly, the field of forensic science began to emerge. This changed everything. Before forensic science, catching a serial killer was almost entirely luck. You needed a witness, a confession, or the killer to be caught in the act. But now, for the first time, investigators could analyze physical evidence. They could match fingerprints found at crime scenes. They could determine if blood came from the victim or the killer. They could examine tool marks, analyze handwriting, and build cases based on physical proof. One of the pioneers of forensic science was Edmond Locard, a French criminologist who established one of the first crime labs in 1910. Locard's exchange principle stated that every contact leaves a trace. When a killer touches a victim, when they walk through a crime scene, they leave something behind. Hair, fibers, fingerprints, and they take something with them. This principle revolutionized criminal investigation and became the foundation of modern forensics. But even with these advances, catching serial killers remained difficult. Forensic science was in its infancy. Crime labs were rare. Most police departments had no training in evidence collection. And killers who moved between jurisdictions could still operate for years without being connected to their crimes. It was not until the mid-20th century, with the development of centralized databases and improved communication between police departments, that law enforcement truly began to win the war against serial killers. There is something disturbing about the fact that we remember serial killers. We know their names. We study their methods. We make documentaries about them. Meanwhile, we often forget their victims. The names of the people they killed are footnotes in history. The killers become infamous, almost celebrated in a twisted way, while their victims fade into obscurity. Why does this happen? Part of it is the mystery. Cases like Jack the Ripper and the Axemen of New Orleans fascinate us because they were never solved. We want answers. We want to know who they were and why they killed. And because we do not have those answers, we fill the gaps with theories, speculation, and imagination. The mystery becomes a puzzle that spans generations. But there is another reason we remember killers. They represent something primal and terrifying. The idea that evil can exist in human form. That someone who looks normal, who lives next door, who passes you on the street, could be a monster. Serial killers challenge our sense of safety and order. They remind us that the world is not as safe as we want to believe. And that is both horrifying and compelling. Still, we should remember the victims. Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The women killed by Jack the Ripper. They were not just victims, they were people. Women who struggled to survive in a brutal world. Women who deserved better than to be remembered only as casualties of a famous killer. The same is true for all the victims throughout history. The children killed by Gilles de Rais. The young women murdered by Elizabeth Bathory. The travelers killed by the Bloody Benders. The shepherds killed by Joseph Vacher. Every victim had a life, a family, dreams that would never be realized. They are not just names in a true crime story. They were real people whose lives were stolen by monsters. By the early 20th century, scientists and doctors were beginning to ask a question that had never been seriously explored before. Why? Why do some people kill repeatedly? What drives them? Is it mental illness? Childhood trauma? Brain damage? Or something else entirely? The field of criminal psychology was born from these questions. And the answers, when they came, were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Most serial killers share certain characteristics. Many experienced severe abuse or trauma in childhood. Many showed early signs of antisocial behavior, such as cruelty to animals, bedwetting, and fire setting, a triad of behaviors now known as the McDonald triad. Many have difficulty forming normal emotional connections. They lack empathy. They see other people as objects, not as humans with feelings and value. But not all serial killers fit this profile. Some, like H. Holmes, came from relatively stable backgrounds. Some were highly intelligent and socially skilled. Some held jobs, had families, and appeared completely normal to everyone around them. This is what makes serial killers so terrifying. There is no single profile, no easy way to identify them before they kill. They hide in plain sight. Psychologists have identified different types of serial killers. Organized killers plan their crimes carefully, target specific types of victims, and take steps to avoid capture. Disorganized killers are impulsive, leaving chaotic crime scenes and often making mistakes that lead to their capture. Some killers are mission-oriented, believing they are ridding the world of people they see as undesirable, like prostitutes or homeless people. Others are hedonistic, killing for pleasure, sexual gratification, or a sense of power. The scariest category is the power and control killer. These killers do not kill for sex or money. They kill because it makes them feel powerful. They enjoy the act of dominating another person, of holding life and death in their hands. Many of the killers we have discussed in this document, Julia de Reyes, Elizabeth Bathory, H. Holmes, fit into this category. They killed because it gave them a sense of godlike control over others. Understanding the psychology of serial killers has helped law enforcement catch them. It has led to the development of criminal profiling, a technique where investigators analyze crime scenes to build a psychological profile of the killer. Profiling is not perfect, but it has helped solve many cases. And it represents a major shift in how we think about serial murder. These killers are no longer demons or monsters. They are humans with broken minds. And that makes them both more understandable and somehow more terrifying. Serial killers have left a mark on culture that goes far beyond their crimes. They have inspired books, movies, television shows, and entire genres of entertainment. True crime has become one of the most popular forms of media, with millions of people consuming documentaries, podcasts, and articles about serial killers. We are fascinated by them, and that fascination says something about us as a society. Part of this fascination is morbid curiosity. We want to understand what we cannot comprehend. How can someone kill without remorse? What drives a person to commit such evil acts? We study serial killers the way we study natural disasters, trying to make sense of something that defies logic. And in that process, we create myths. We turn killers into legends. We sanitize their crimes into entertainment. This is not new. As we have seen throughout this document, serial killers have been mythologized for centuries. Julia de Reyes became Bluebeard. Elizabeth Bathory became the Blood Countess. Jack the Ripper became the ultimate unsolved mystery. And in the 20th century, killers like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer became household names, their faces as recognizable as movie stars. But there's a danger in this cultural obsession. When we make serial killers famous, we risk glorifying them. Some killers, like Carl Panzram, crave notoriety. They wanted to be remembered. And by endlessly discussing their crimes, making movies about them, analyzing their every move, we give them exactly what they wanted. We make them immortal. Still, there is value in studying serial killers. Understanding how they think, how they operate, and how they evade capture has helped law enforcement save lives. Forensic psychology, criminal profiling, and modern investigative techniques all emerged from the study of serial murder. We have learned how to catch killers faster, how to identify patterns, and how to prevent future victims. That knowledge is worth something, even if it comes at the cost of making monsters famous. The history of serial killers is also the history of law enforcement learning how to fight back. In the medieval period, there was no organized police force. Justice was local, arbitrary, and often brutal. By the 18th and 19th centuries, cities began forming professional police departments. But they had no training in investigation, no forensic tools, and no way to track criminals across jurisdictions. The 20th century changed everything. Police departments became more professional. Detective divisions were established. Crime labs were built. Communication between departments improved. And for the first time, serial killers could be tracked across state and national borders. The development of fingerprint databases, criminal record systems, and later, DNA databases made it increasingly difficult for killers to operate undetected. One of the most significant developments was the creation of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in the 1970s. This unit, which later became famous through shows like Manhunter, specialized in studying serial killers and developing profiles to help catch them. Agents like Robert Ressler and John Douglas interviewed dozens of incarcerated serial killers, learning how they thought, how they chose victims, and how they avoided capture. This information was used to create the modern science of criminal profiling. Today, catching serial killers is easier than ever before. DNA analysis can link a killer to a crime scene with near certainty. Security cameras record movements. Cell phone data tracks locations. Social media leaves digital footprints. The modern serial killer operates in a world saturated with surveillance and technology. And while they still exist, they are caught much faster than their historical counterparts. But law enforcement still faces challenges. Killers who target marginalized populations like prostitutes or homeless people can still operate for years because their victims are not prioritized. Killers who move frequently or operate in multiple jurisdictions can evade capture. And some, the smart ones, simply stop killing before they are caught, disappearing into normal life and leaving their crimes unsolved. The war against serial killers is far from over. We have traveled through centuries. From ancient Rome to Victorian London, from medieval castles to American frontiers, from the age of werewolf trials to the dawn of forensic science. And one thing has remained constant. Serial killers have always existed. They are not a modern phenomenon. They are a dark thread woven through the entire history of humanity. What has changed is our ability to recognize them. In the past, they were called monsters, demons, vampires, werewolves. We created supernatural explanations because the truth was too horrifying to accept. That a human, someone who looked just like us, could commit such evil. But now we know better. Serial killers are not possessed. They are not cursed. They are people. Broken, damaged, or simply evil people. And that is more terrifying than any myth. We have also learned how to fight them. Forensic science, criminal profiling, and modern technology have made it harder for serial killers to operate undetected. We can catch them faster. We can stop them sooner. We can save lives. But the cost of that progress has been paid in blood. The victims of Gila de Reis, Elizabeth Bathory, Jack the Ripper, H. Holmes, and countless others died so we could learn. Their deaths taught us how to recognize patterns, how to investigate crimes, how to understand the minds of killers. But we should never forget that behind every statistic, every case study, every infamous name, there are victims. Real people whose lives were stolen. Families who never got closure. Communities that were shattered by fear. Serial killers may be fascinating to study, but their victims deserve more than to be footnotes in a true crime story. They deserve to be remembered as people, not just casualties. So as we close this journey through the darkest corners of history, remember this. The monsters were never supernatural. They were human. They walked among us. They smiled. They spoke. They lived ordinary lives, and then they killed. Again and again. Until they were stopped, or until they simply stopped themselves. Serial killers have always existed. And as long as humans walk this earth, they probably always will. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Lock your doors tonight. Remember that history is filled with monsters, and the scariest part? They all looked human.